Good morning. My name is David Atkinson. I'm a product manager at Redgate. I cover the end-to-end delivery story, so that means any changes you might make in your development environment, commit to source control, which may trigger some sort of automated build and testing process, and that follows through to release management. And that's something that I won't be covering today, but will be covered in the next session. So what will we cover today? Database build automation. What is database build automation? Why should you do database build automation? And more importantly, I think how. So how can you get this up and running? And of course, I'll be covering how to do that with Redgate tools. Please put your hand up if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Especially if I go too fast or I take something for granted. So before we start, I'd like to get a show of hands for these four categories. So I want to know how evolved you already are in the sort of agile database development practices. So we've got category one, which is you've got your database objects and scripts, but they aren't in version control. So you just manage them in a database. You're not scripting them out, or you're not using any tooling. Number two is you are managing your objects and scripts in version control, so you're using some sort of tool to do that, and that could be SQL Source Control or other vendor tools. Category three, you're doing some sort of build automation, so it could be continuous integration or something that's fired off once a day or on a schedule. But it's building and testing or testing your database. And lastly, are you automating, do you have an automated release system? So are your changes, and maybe your application changes and your database changes, being pushed up using some release tool? So first of all, hands up who isn't doing any sort of version control for their databases. So we've got possibly about 10 people. You're using something like SQL Source Control or maybe Visual Studio to do this, or your own internal tooling. So slightly more, that's good. Who's using a build system with your database changes, trying to push those up, trying to test them in any way? So we've got maybe 3. And release management. Anyone doing release management? 4 databases? Good. That's, I think, 4 people. So I'm going to be covering this step here, so which is good because I think most people are doing 2, and a few people are doing 3. So before we start, we've got to define what continuous integration is. So I use the words continuous integration and build automation interchangeably. They're pretty much the same thing. One is just a more automated form of the other. One is triggered by a check-in, and one of them is done maybe on schedule. So Jez Humble, he's a consultant at ThoughtWorks. He wrote a great book called Continuous Delivery. I'd recommend that you take a look at that. It's not too technical, but it has some very good guidelines. He defined continuous integration as a practice designed to ensure that your software is always working and that you get comprehensive feedback in a few minutes as to whether any given change to your system has broken it. So I think that's a great definition. It describes the need in terms of the speed at which you get feedback as a developer. You don't want to get feedback in a few months' time, because that's too late. Too many people have been impacted by that in the meantime. Anyway, that's the definition for general application development. But what is database continuous integration? What does that mean? So I would like to suggest that we simply say that database continuous integration is a practice designed to ensure that your database is always working and that you get comprehensive feedback in a few minutes as to whether any given change to your system has broken it in being the database. And this is what it looks like in the diagram. You have your development team. They can be using a shared database or ideally dedicated databases. When they commit changes, they go into a version control system. This could be TFS, version, Git, Mercurial, Vault. That either triggers a build or the build is run nightly, for example. That does some building, and we'll go into that in the next slides, and also does some testing. So why continuous integration? So I alluded a bit to that earlier on. So it's about identifying issues as early as possible. So you don't want to identify issues because your customers find them. In the keynote earlier, we described a scenario whereby a developer made a change, that change got pushed out to production. We used SQL Monitor to identify that there was an issue, and we used Deploy Manager to roll back to a previous working version. And that's great, and tools that help you do that are all well and good. However, that change should never have been pushed out to production in the first place. And ideally, these breaking changes would never make it to the DBA either. If it's got to the DBA, then it's probably at the end of the project, once every 6 months when deployment happens, and that's too late. You don't want to find out at the last moment. And you don't want to find out when testers get it. If testers get a broken build, I used to be a tester. If I got given software and I ran it, and the first thing that happened, it caused an exception, wouldn't even work to the basic degree, I'd get really annoyed with the developers. That's not what you want to see. You expect the build to be of a certain minimum quality, and you have build validation tests to verify that. And before the other developers find them. So generally you're working in a team, it's not just you. If you make a breaking change, you commit that to source control, and another developer takes that change and it breaks their machine, you're not going to be very popular. So, what does build mean? Build means compile. That's for application code. You take the code, compile it. If it compiles, it builds. It's very simple. For database code, you can build a database. You run a creation script that runs all the create statements in the right order, and you build a database. That's great. So that's the equivalent, except for the fact that generally you have an existing database out there. So the difference between application code and database code is that applications, you can wipe the old one away and you just replace it with a new one and you're good to go. With databases, more often than not, unless it's the first time you're building the application, you've got an existing database that you have to upgrade. That database has data, and therefore you have to preserve that data as you move forward. You can't throw it away and start again. Testing. So what is test? For .NET code, you may have heard of NUnit, for example. There are lots of open source frameworks for the .NET platform, and generally you'll run those on development. So developers will be encouraged to run unit tests locally before checking those changes into source control. When they do commit those to source control, that will generally run those same tests, and or maybe a different set of tests, on those changes, plus everyone else's changes integrated together. That's why it's called integration. So sometimes you might get a change that passes locally, but in combination with other recent check-ins, it will break, and continuous integration will catch that and alert development teams pretty early. Not as early as on a local development machine, but it's not bad because it's happening continuously behind the scenes. So for the database, there's a tool called TSQLT. It's an open source, like NUnit, open source tool, free to use, and it's a great framework, and I encourage you to look at it, and it's the equivalent for SQL Server databases. We have a tool, Redgate has a tool called SQL Test, and that's a wrapper around TSQLT, and that provides a level of Management Studio integration. You don't need to use it to use TSQLT, but some people like GUIs, so we provide that for you. So most of the rest of the session will be a demo. Yeah, that's a question?
So if you're not using stored procedures, what else would you test with your database?
I guess that's entirely up to you. We're not being prescriptive here.
Or what would you recommend, or what do you guys do?
Anything to do with tables and views, you could select from them. You can check for data exists in various tables.
You can test things like naming conventions are adhered to. You can do tests for performance. You could test that the databases that you're creating are valid.
So I'll be giving an example in a second where we simply select from a view and we time that just to see how quick that is. And yes, I guess there are a bunch of things. I mean, I'm not an expert on unit testing myself, so I think that the best thing I would advise is that there's a Google Groups forum for T-SQL-T. If you post to that and say, if I have no stored procedures, what sort of assessment do you recommend, and see what response you get. But as Anna pointed out, there are best practice tests that you can run. So you can we provide a bunch of SQL cop tests in the box, but there are others you can download if you Google for SQL cop T-SQL-T, and they do best practices. The cool thing about those is that you don't have to write any code yourself. They're already written. They'll check for things like make sure you don't have any stored procedures to start with SP underscore, maybe making sure that you don't have select stars. Well, we wouldn't have that in stream, we have that in tables. We might have that in a view. So that there are various checks. But anything you can express in SQL, you could in theory write as a test if that's useful. So the scenario of my demo will be is as follows. I'm one of a team of developers working on the SimpleTalk website. And that's, as you know, a community website for .NET and SQL Server developers. A change has been made to SimpleTalk's homepage that has been checked into the version control system. So this is taking the exact same scenario that you saw in the keynote. These changes will eventually be deployed to production. Unlike the keynote, we're not just going to deploy it. So, because I have been hired to ensure that best practices are adhered to try to ensure that the deployment will go smoothly. And what I mean by deployment is that once it's deployed and the users get to use it, functionally, the changes aren't breaking. But also, that the upgrade works. It's not just about being deployed, it's about how you get deployed. And we need to therefore ensure that the upgrade process it works before we get to the end of the project. I've already configured a continuous integration, so I'm not going to do this as part of the demo because it's a bit tedious, and setting up build systems is not what this session is about. You might already have build systems. In fact, a quick show of hands, who already has a build system? This could be TFS build, TeamCity, Jenkins. Okay, just half a dozen. But what we've configured on this build system is a Redgate a script. And we've got a plugin for TeamCity, but we've got NAND scripts and MS build scripts which you can plug straight into your existing build server. We'll be keeping a database up to date with the latest changes. We'll be running automated T-SQL-T tests, and we'll be generating some data as well as part of that. We'll be generating documentation, and we'll also be generating deployment scripts. Deployment scripts being creation scripts and also upgrade scripts. The tools that are going to be used as part of this demo are TeamCity, but this really doesn't matter. Any tool will do. It's just we happen to use that at Redgate, and it's quite easy one to configure. There's what we call the SQL Automation Pack, which is a bunch of resources. That includes the TeamCity plugin, but also the NAND and MS build scripts that you can use in your other build tools. And I'll cover SQL Source Control, although not in any detail because that was covered in the previous session. Briefly cover SQL Test, Data Generator, and SQL Doc. Okay, let's go. So to give you an idea of what this, my environment looks like, this is my development database. It's install, zoom it. Good. Okay. So we have SimpleTalk dev underscore David. That's my database. And we've got this fictitious user, SimpleTalk dev underscore Grant, who is also linked to the same repository in Source Control. My database, which is here, let me just show you that there's stuff in it, is linked to my application, which is in Visual Studio, an ASP.NET application, and I can press 5 to build it. And with any luck, you'll see that we've got SimpleTalk up, and it's looking good. For those of you who didn't attend the last session here with Steve, I'll just show you quickly how you might make a bunch of changes in Source Control. So I'm using snippets here rather than typing. So I'm just going to make a bunch of changes to Simple talk dev_David, and visit the SQL Source Control tab. And you can see in the commit list there'll be a bunch of changes that are just made. So I've added some static data. So I've got an insert statement here. I've modified a store procedure, and I've also added a new store procedure called SQL City_US. And all I will do is I'll type in a comment. These are some changes, and click on commit, and that goes into my version control system. And any other developer who's linked to the same repository will be able to go to the Get Latest tab, and with any luck, see those changes. So the exact same changes I made, I can see in my Get Latest, and Grant can click on Get Latest to fetch those, and it's just one click away. And that's SQL Source Control in a nutshell. So what's also happened is that because we have Team City, this is the Team City UI, what we've done is we've kicked off a build, because Team City is configured to do continuous integration, not a nightly scheduled build, for example. So you can see it's running through various steps, and in 2 minutes and 40 seconds it will finish. That is estimated based on the last time it ran. I won't show you too much about Team City, but I'll show you the main ingredients of how to set it up. So Team City requires you to tell it where in source control to look. So you've got a source control repository, there's a URL associated with that. If I go to version control settings, I will see here we've got SVN, which is subversion, and a URL that specifies where in subversion to look. And so that's configured there. We need to build trigger, so when to trigger? Do we trigger on every check-in, or do we trigger once a day or once a night? And you can see here we've got a VCS trigger. That means it triggers the build after each version control system check-in is detected. So this is doing continuous integration. And the only other thing you need is something to happen once that triggers. So this is the script that you run, and that's configured in the build step section. And what you can see here is that we've got a Redgate SQL Server build step, which is a plugin into Team City, but it would be an MS build script in Team Build, for example. And if I drill down, you can see exactly how we've set this up. So it's a very nice UI. You've got some fields to fill in and some options to select. So the first one is update a database and then rebuild. So we have a database always up to date with source control. That's here, so you can see this database exists there, and that will always stay up to date with every change that goes in. So continuous integration will push the latest changes that are checked in to that database. We have T-SQL-T, so we want to run T-SQL-T unit tests on the database. We also want to populate the database with test data, and for that you have to create a SQL data generator project file so it knows which tables to populate. We're also creating documentation for the database, and that uses SQL Doc in the back end, which is another tool in the developer bundle. And we have generate creation scripts, and also we've got generate upgrade script, and lastly create a database package. And the reason we have to create a database package is that is the format that Deployment Manager, which is the tool that you can use for automated .NET and SQL release management, that's the format it consumes. And I'm not going to cover that today, but if you attend the session with Grant and David Simler, then you'll get more information about that. So, as you can see, this is still running the build. I can drill down and show you the last build and just get you, so you can get a feel for what it looks like. So here we can see a bunch of tests that have been run, and they've all passed.
There's a question.
Sorry, question not one.
You may have already said this, but Team City, is that like an open source thing?
Team City is a tool by a company called JetBrains. So they're the guys behind ReSharper, which is a very popular Visual Studio add-in. This tool is not open source, so it's a commercial tool, but it's free for up to 5 projects and 3 build agents, I think. So if you're a small shop and you don't have huge requirements, this is effectively free.
But Jenkins is the free equivalent, isn't it?
Sorry?
Jenkins.
Oh no, Jenkins is a tool that was forked from Hudson, which used to be a very popular tool until Oracle decided to take it over and overly influence its direction. So someone forked it because it was open source, and Jenkins is now the most popular open source build tool out there. So Jenkins is something that you can use as well, and you probably use a NAT script that's in the SQL automation pack if you wanted to try that tool out. So we have documentation here. I can just show you, this is just SQL doc output, just load a table, article prices. You can see there's various metadata, including the script for the table. And this is particularly useful because you can, it's HTML, you can publish this to a website maybe, and it becomes a resource for all your developers in the team to be able to look at as they develop. So that's quite a handy thing to do as part of a continuous build. Let's see how our build's doing. So build's finished now, so I can show you the artifact we've just built. So this is the deployment manager package. It's just a zip file. And within that you can see it's got an upgrades folder, it's got a creation script here. If I launch the creation script, you'll see that it just loads this. I can fire it up in the Management Studio, and no surprise to see there are lots of create statements. Just a huge bunch of create statements to build my database from scratch. And of course the insert statements as well for my static data tables. Question?
Yeah, did you say that, do you have a plugin for TeamCity? And if so, is there one available for Jenkins?
We do have a plugin for TeamCity. We don't have one for Jenkins yet, but we do have a very nicely templated NAND script and MS build script that does exactly the same, but it's just a text file and you just fill in various parameters within that and it will do exactly the same thing. So this TeamCity plugin is just a wrapper around exactly the same functionality. And in turn, that just runs the SQL development tool command lines that we produced. There was a question.
Yeah, when you build the database, if you have migration scripts that you check in the version when the database changes, does that pick that up too?
The question is, does it pick up the migration? Is the migrations feature currently in SQL Source Control?
Yes.
I'll be covering that a little later. We have rewritten that feature and we've improved it a lot. So I think it will become clear later on in this session. Okay.
Can I just say about Jenkins, on the SQL in the City website, you can see the slides for all of the talks, and there was one in Pasadena by someone who couldn't be here today on setting up Jenkins with Deployment Manager.
Yeah, so Ernest Huang did a session in Pasadena, and presumably his slides, I don't know if the session was recorded.
The slides are up there, and he's got a GitHub repository.
Yeah, so he'll be able to give you examples as well. I think he's created some examples on GitHub. Was there another question? Okay. So we've been given a task. I've been given a task. I need to ensure that this change has been made, which incidentally, if you remember from the keynote, is just adding this estimated time to read the article. So it's fairly simple. But as we saw in the keynote, it caused problems. So I just need to ensure that doesn't adversely impact the main web page for the users. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a test. So I'm just going to SQL test, and this is me up here. It's auto-detectable, the test I already have. I'm going to add it to unit tests. So new test. Load time. Up to create test. And this creates a blank test with nothing in it that fails by default. And the reason it fails is so that you don't get false positives that it succeeded even though you haven't written the test. So if I run the test now, you can see that it's got a red X next to it and it fails. So what I'm going to do is fill this in with the actual test, which is conveniently in a snippet. Very quickly, this test, what it does is that there's a loop. It goes around this loop 5 times, and it selects from v_articles, which is what the displays the main page, and it finds the average for the time it's taken to do that. And if the elapsed time is above 150 milliseconds, it fails. If it's lower, it passes. It's very simple. So if I apply that and I run the tests, it's passed. And if you can see at the bottom, you can see that it's averaged out at 78 milliseconds, which is fast enough for me. And I'm going to just check in the application itself, just to make sure that it works. Press F5. F5. Yeah, see that, okay. So, I've checked it, it's passed. So, I'm going to commit this change into source control. So, this is my test I'm committing, it's just a stored procedure. Nothing can possibly go wrong now. Oops, spell. And that's committed. It's gone into source control and will have kicked off a build. The really cool thing is that because it's a stored procedure in your source control system, any other user that's linked to that same repository will see those tests. So Grant can see the test, Grant can click get latest, pull the test onto his machine, and in SQL test for Grant, if I refresh this, I'll see the test has appeared. So this means that Grant can run not only his tests, but all the tests that have been written by all the developers, and that allows him to ensure that any changes that he makes doesn't break someone else's code. And that's a really cool feature that's just a byproduct of the fact that the test framework is built into your database. So I'm just going to quickly run that as Grant, and hopefully it'll pass as well. But of course, what you don't want to do is for those T-SQL tests to be accidentally deployed to production, because they do instrument your database and may have some performance impact. So you want to avoid deploying the T-SQL framework object and the T-SQL tests as you move your changes through the latter environments. And there's a SQL compare option that will ignore all those objects for you. So I recommend you find that, because it's off by default. You have to turn it on. So if we go to Team City, we can see a build has kicked off, and with any luck, it will pass, and it will be fine. So I'd like to stop there and just find out whether there are any questions about what we've done so far. One question?
What were the other options when you, I think the option you chose was do a build with every change that's checked in? Is that what you chose?
In the Team City option, we chose to kick off a build by every time there was a change in version control. So that's the build trigger.
So how would you do that in practice? Because you wouldn't deploy every database change individually. You would deploy it with a set of changes usually. I think that's how we would anyway.
Yeah. So I'm not deploying really. I'm just
just building. So
I'm just building.
You have multiple builds applied for a deployment then?
Yeah, so I'm building and then I'm throwing away after I build. But I keep these scripts for reference. So these packages that are created are what we call build artifacts. And a build artifact is just something that you produce as part of a build that is interesting enough to keep. So I keep the package as the artifact, because then I have a record of what the state of the database was at that time. I have a record of the creation scripts and the upgrade scripts, and I can just pull these out and run them if I want to go back and create any environment. But when I come to deploying my changes to production, then I would take whichever build, I'll pick the build that I think is the good build that I want to deploy, and I can pull the upgrade scripts out of that and run them against production. Staging first, obviously, and then production. And Deployment Manager, which is the tool that I'm not covering in the session, which we'll cover next, can automate that, because it knows how to consume those, and it just provides a nice UI and a way to manage those environments. So something's gone wrong here. So let's try to find out what's happening. So it's saying SQL CI failed with error message. Running unit tests failed. Okay, right. Let's drill down into this failed build. See if we can fix it. So unit test, load time, one test failed. That's strange because this is the exact test that we just ran in the local environment. So I ran this test, it went green. I went to my development copy, manually tested it by pressing F5, and it loaded. I don't really know what's going on. So if I drill down further, I can get the output for this particular message. And what it's saying here is that load time for 10,000 articles is not acceptable above 150 milliseconds. So 150 milliseconds is my threshold that I can't go over. And it seems to have taken 388. But the key thing here is to see that I'm doing a load time for 10,000 articles. And one thing, because we're generating data at the same time, so that box was checked in my CI build step. Whereas for my database here, if I can do a select count from articles, also point that to my database. I can see I've got 5. So I've got 5 articles in my development environment, and I have 10,000 in my continuous integration environment. So my CI environment has been set up to mimic as close as possible the environment that production may have. So maybe there's a specification that says SimpleTalk has to support 10,000 articles, and someone has created that and checked that in to my build system. So I only have 5 here. That's not very good. So that's possibly the reason why it passed my environment but not continuous integration. So what I really want to do is try to reproduce this, troubleshoot it, and hopefully fix the issue. So what I can do is I can find the project file, which is a SQL data generator project file, and load that locally and reproduce the same quantities of data in my local environment. So I'm just going to double click on this. This will launch SQL data generator.
So in all cases, would you, like, to troubleshoot an issue like this, I'm just like, what if bringing the amount of production data down to the developer system is effective? What would you do?
So the question is, what if putting the data from production to a development environment is impractical? Is that impractical for the quantity or just for data sensitivity?
Well, let's say, yeah, say you have multi-terabyte databases, it's just basics.
Okay. If you can't do it for bring it to a development environment, then you'll have to find, if you want to reproduce it, because there's a performance impact, you'll have to point to your development environment as something that has lots of data. And you'd hope that there'd be at least one environment out there, maybe a staging environment that you could borrow to try to reproduce this issue. But without that, it's going to be quite tough to simulate those loads.
So presumably we have, whether it's CI or something okay.
Yes. So if you can just afford to have one other test environment other than production that has the equivalent of production, then maybe the CI can be using that as well as part of its process if it's not used for other things as well. Yeah, that's I don't think there's an easy answer for that. So this is data generator. It lists all my tables on the left-hand side, and you can see that I've selected articles and contacts. So these are the 2 tables that we generate data for. So you can see here we've got 10,000 articles, and for contacts we have 1,000. I'm not going to cover this tool in too much detail, but needless to say that you can just configure it to your heart's content. It tries to populate your data with sensible looking data depending on the names, the column types, and the data types as well. So if I click generate data, it will apply 10,000 rows to SimpleTalk_David. In this specific case, 10,000 isn't that much, so there's no reason for developing environments to not have this data. One question?
Is there any way to build this into a test? So on a test, it loads that much data?
The question is it possible to build that into a test? The answer is yes, because T-SQL-T, it depends. There are different ways of doing unit tests. There are two different camps here. One camp is build a data set, put it on a database, and then write some tests against that data set. And the other camp is every test should be doing that. Every test should be building the data required to run the test, running the test, and then tearing down and resetting that data. And they have their pros and cons. So if you just have one data set, then all your tests could end up being dependent on the last one, and you could have you could change some of that data, then many tests could fail. Whereas if you have your data built up for each test, they're much more resilient to that sort of behaviour. But there's no reason why you couldn't have a test that builds up lots of data. If you do it in T-SQL-T, it's going to roll it back at the end of the test because it runs everything in a transaction. So if you build any data, it will roll it back. So you can do it within the scope of the test, but you can't build a test that builds all the data and then expect that to persist for the remainder of the test. What you would do there is you'd use the SQL data generator command line and add that as a separate build step before you're running your unit tests, if you wanted to do it that way. But yes, you can do that. So I've generated some data, and just to prove that we have data, let's press F5, and we have exactly 10,005, because I've added that on top of the 5 I had previously. So let's see if I can reproduce this issue by running the same test locally. And it already looks like it's slow, and no surprise to see that we have elapsed time milliseconds 383, which is well above 150. Yes, so I've reproduced that. I can also refresh my local web app to see what happens. And it should perform slowly. And it's not only performed slowly, it's failed because of some other error. Let's troubleshoot this error. So we have objects cannot be cast from DB null. That's a bit strange because that doesn't seem to be anything to do with what I'm trying to fix. And I have a convert to date time on a published date column. So data generator will look at the individual data types of the fields that it's populating, so published date, for example, and populate it with just random data. And random values can also be null if those columns allow null. And you can see that there's an allow nulls value that's checked because my published date data type is a null rather than a not null column. I could uncheck this box, rerun the data generation, and refresh my web app, and everything will be fine. But if I know that published date, there should always be a published date for an article, why isn't it just a not null column to start off with? So I'm going to fix this, not by changing the data I'm generating. I'm going to fix it by ensuring that we have a not null published date column. And as you can see, I have to run an update on my table because I have all those nulls the data generators put in it. And I'm setting the published date column to be the 1st of January 2000, where published date is null, and then I'm running the alter to make it not null. So F5, let's apply the change. Let's see if that's fixed it. F5. Great. So it's fixed the problem. I can now see my website. It's not failing because there's a null issue, but it doesn't appear to be performing that well. So we still have the performance issue. So at this point, I would I didn't make the change that added this new feature. It was somebody else. It was David Simner who was in the first in the keynote session. I would contact him. I would point out that his code may not have been the code that he expected it to be, and so we can't deploy that to production. We need to fix it. He would go ahead and make the change, commit that in source control, and that would kick off my load time test again, and hopefully it will pass. I'm going to fix it on his behalf because he's not here, and I'm just going to run fix for the articles. And then what this will do is it actually just runs a few changes that will improve the performance of this particular feature. And I'm going to demonstrate that by running my test, and I can see that it's fantastic. It takes 7 milliseconds. This is really, really good. Go back here, press F5. Wow, this is quick. Every time I press F5, it's great. I'm pretty confident now that it works. I've got 10,000 articles, and I've got a passing unit test, and I've got a passing manual test. I'm going to commit this change into source control. Fixed the problem. Surely this will now work. I'm a genius. So, I'm create the change. Chastise my colleague for not having written the good code in the first place. And of course, this will kick off another build. Other developers will be able to click on Get Latest and pull the fix, which involves the two fixes. One of them is the data type, which is changing it from null to not null, and the other one is the fixed the view, which has improved the performance. So if I click Get Latest now and Grant takes on the changes, can anyone anticipate any potential issue here? Guys in Atlanta got this, so.
You may have no values in that.
Very good, very good. So you're just as good as the guys in Atlanta. So Grant, let's have a quick look at what Grant might have. Select star from articles. Change that to Grant. And right, here we go. So you'll see within this box we have Grant's data. Grant also just has 5 articles, which isn't great, so he should be encouraged to generate more data. But he has 3 null values in the publish state. So he's going to fail as well when he clicks Get Latest. And but he won't know that it fails. I mean, generally when you click Get Latest, you shouldn't really have to think about what you're getting. You just want to get the latest changes that other developers have checked in. So you'd probably come in first thing in the morning, Get Latest, possibly see this morning that says the column publish date and table articles is being marked as not null, there's no default value, so the update may fail, but think, oh well, everything's fine. And of course it isn't fine, because that's exactly the problem. When it runs the script against its database, it will fail because it can't insert the value null into a not null column. So, what's the solution? So let's go back to the slides for a second. So there's a feature called migration scripts. We released this last year, and we've actually just rewritten it, and we've taken a totally different approach because there were some issues about resilience, especially using it with different branches, and we think we've architected it in a way that works much better. So just a brief summary of how this works. So when you generate a deployment script, you have maybe version 1 and version 12, and you have some changes underneath. So changes are made by developers making changes to the database and committing them. So you can see the sorts of changes you might have. SQL Compare, the way it generates a script is that it looks at version 1, it looks at version 12, sees that there are changes, and if there are changes, it infers a deployment script. So it will just guess how to get from A to B. But not all changes can be inferred. So what if there's a table rename from version 5 to version 9 to version 10? If there's a table rename, SQL Compare is going to see a table with table A and a table called table B. There are 2 possible ways that could have happened. You could have dropped table A and recreate a totally new table B, or you could have renamed table A to table B. And the distinction is very important because one of them, preserves the data in the table, the other one doesn't. You need to know which one that you're doing. If you rename a column that has exactly the same issue, and as we've just seen, adding a not null column or modifying a column to be not null without a default causes that issue. Merging tables, splitting tables, merging columns, splitting columns. There's some logic there that only the user knows. If you turn a full name into a first name and last name, you have to write some logic to take the first bit, put it into a column, the second bit into another column. And SQL Compare can't work that out for you. Any data transformation or data motion that you do as part of an upgrade, it's not going to know. Only you have that knowledge. So this feature, migrations, allows you to create your own custom migration scripts and save them into the knowledge that SQL Compare, SQL Source Control has access to. And of course, this continuous integration process will have access to this knowledge as well. So with migration scripts, it will run migration scripts first. So it will create the overall deployment scripts, but based on migration scripts having run first. So here you've got version 1, and those will take you to 1 prime. This isn't a real version. This is a sort of a virtual version that will never quite exist in reality, because SQL Compare fills in the gap between 1 prime and 12, and the combined script becomes the deployment script. So let's go back to our database. So as you can see, we have a migrations tab here. And you simply click Add Migration Script if you know that there's a change that you need to make that has to be covered by a migration script. And this migration script will so go to update existing data for publish date when setting to null, I'll do. And I'm going to, again, use a snippet. And what this snippet does, as we saw when we fixed the problem, we have the update statement that sets the published date to be the 1st of January 2000, where it finds null values. And then we have the alter that changes the column to be not null. So this will ensure that all my upgrades, including get latest, including the CI updates, will work.
You wouldn't strictly need the alter in there because SQL Compare would pick that up, right?
That's true, yeah.
Either way.
So SQL Compare will address anything that the migration script doesn't. So if you don't have the alter there, then it should work.
Would it know though? Because it's part of, is it going to do an examination before you?
It will know because the way it builds the script is that that 1 prime database that I showed earlier, it actually builds in memory. So it creates a local DB, runs the migration scripts, then it has that database that it uses the data source for the subsequent comparison with the latest in source control to build that second part. So it doesn't know. It won't try to run it. It won't duplicate that change. And there's a bit that we call the guard clause beforehand to make sure that the script doesn't run in situations, for example, when the published date column hasn't yet been created. So if you run it against an earlier database that you haven't previously run migration scripts on, it doesn't know that you haven't run this update. So this is to make it idempotent so that when you run the script twice, for example, then it's not going to fail the second time around. So what I need to do now is click Save and Close, and I commit this change to source control just like any other change. And of course, the beauty of this is that in this particular scenario, I have Grant, who I found the issue because he happened to do a get latest very, very soon after I made the change and committed that source control. If you had given it 3 minutes, then we would have had a failed build. And this build has failed because, no surprise here, it's aborting. Oops, that was the wrong button. How do we go with this? Let's see. Okay, let's do it again. So it's high severity warning, columns marked as not null because of publish date. It's the same problem that we had before, the same problem we saw when we did get latest. But CI has picked up on it because it's always incrementally trying to keep that database up to date. Or if it had that passed, it would have failed to validate my upgrade script on the subsequent test. So CI has caught this. It would have notified me that my change has broken the build, not functionally, because functionally I fixed it. The performance is now fine. The test will pass on this. But my upgrade process, which is part of ensuring that my database works, because your database is not just about the functionality, it's about the ability to take your existing version and move that to the next version. That's failed. I'll be notified within good time, and I can commit that change before anyone's noticed. So hopefully Grant won't have done a get latest yet, and I'll click commit. And if Grant were to wait a little and click get latest now, see all the changes. So these are my 2 bug fixes. I see that I have the migrations history table value function. So this is where we save the information. So prior to this, we tried to pull some information out of your version control system, which required lots of very strange looking code specific to version control systems. Now we just query this table value function, and we put it in a Redgate schema so that you know it's our stuff.
So this is a relatively new change in the way you handle migration scripts?
Yes, it is.
Like the last couple of months?
This is a very new change. It hasn't yet been released. There's a beta release that you can get, but there'll be an even better one released in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, it looked a little unfamiliar.
Yes. So this one, presumably, have you tried it before? The old migrations?
I've run the old migrations where you pick 2 versions and then change the generated code. So that looked good.
Yeah. So we hope this is a lot simpler. Obviously, we'd like you to try it and make sure it works in your scenario. If you'd like to after this session, come and have a chat with me, I'll take the details and maybe we can follow up and be very useful. So, get latest. So what's happening now is that get latest will take slightly longer because what we're doing is we're building a local DB, running the migration scripts against it in order to get that one prime database that we can compare to the latest to. So the SQL compare component can be attached to the migration scripts. Well, then you're lucky. It will then do the update. And it hasn't warned me, so presumably, if I do a select star from articles, and I look at publish date, I can see, whoops, well, you get the idea. I can see that I've got some 1st of January entries there where it used to be null. So it's applied the migration script, it hasn't lost my data, hasn't failed to run. So Grant will be hopefully oblivious of the fact that I made a change, CI failed, I was notified, and I quickly fixed it. So I want to fix it as soon as possible. So I want to fix it ideally before other developers break their build and come and have words with me. So let's.
So just a question.
Yeah.
So will that migration script will run now every time anybody gets latest?
Yes.
Prevention in the future?
So will the migration script run forever? It will run as long as it has already been run before. So the target database keeps track of which migration scripts have been previously run. It won't try to run them again. But even if it did, if you've written your guard calls correctly, it probably won't do any harm because it will just work out that it's not in the right state to be run in. But SQL Compare will use it, Get Latest and the SQL Source Control will use it, the CI process will use it, and Deployment Manager will also use it. Another question?
The question, so Deployment Manager, like the demo this morning, they had to go back, so Deployment Manager can reverse the logic on that?
Yes, so the question is, can we go downwards as well as upwards? That's a very good question. So if you take a closer look at the table value function that we create, how am I doing for time? Okay, well, I'll wrap up quite quickly, but I think this is worth seeing because that's a very good question. So this is what it looks like. As you can see, we've got something called up script, and we've put that in there. We also have something called down script. So the answer is yes. However, we haven't actually built the UI to let you do the down script. So you can't specify that it's up or down, which would obviously be an obvious thing for us to do. But if you actually just modify this table value function directly, then you can actually get it working. Apparently it does work. But we will be adding it to the UI, and we will be able to then run the down migration script as part of all that.
But you have to write your own downward migration script too. It's not like you can just revert to logic.
Oh, do you have to write your own down migration script? The answer is no if SQL Compare can handle it, because obviously you don't need a down migration script if SQL Compare's doing the diffing.
Yeah.
But if there's some sort of logic where you've done a column split, and you want to then do a merge, you obviously need to write that merge. It's not clever enough to take your up script and interpret that and then build the opposite, which would be a really nice feature, but I'm not sure that will be in the product anytime soon. So very, very quickly, I'm just going to cycle through the remaining slides. What we've seen is what database CI does. It runs updates on the database continuously. It will run GCQuery tests, generate up-to-date documentation, generate and validate deployment scripts, and these scripts are obviously creation scripts as well as upgrade scripts, and publishes to Deploy Manager. What we did today is we added a new test to try to ensure that a change that we made to SimpleTalk wouldn't propagate to the live site, so we wanted to catch that early. But what happened is continuous integration identified a failure, so it was a good thing that we wrote this test. We reproduced the bug locally by using data generator to create a realistic local environment. We inadvertently found a second bug, so it's because of the data type for published date was null, whereas it should be not null. So we fixed both bugs, tested them locally, committed to source control, which kicked off another build. But that new build didn't pass directly because that identified the fact that although very possibly the load test issue had been resolved and that was passing, the upgrade was failing because one of our fixes required an update statement that we needed to add as a migration script. So once we added that, we saw how Grant would be warned that the not null issue would cause problems. I added the migration scripts. We did a get latest for Grant, and that worked fine. And we committed that to obviously source control, so that would have kicked off a totally new build in source control. That's 2 minutes ago, and you can see that it's passed. So now we have the load testing. So the functionality that we wanted to fix now works. So we know that the estimated read time feature that was added hasn't broken it for 10,000 articles. And we also know that we can upgrade from the current database to the latest in source control because we've added that migration script to solve that issue. This is the white paper that we've written on continuous integration. It's available outside, I think. If not, go to redgate.com/CI. If you are interested in putting continuous integration into place, do speak to us and leave your details because we'd like to follow up with you and help you get it working because the functionality is still early, so the migrations feature is new, and if you need any assistance, then we'd love to help you there. So I'll open up the floor to questions very, very quickly, maybe a couple, and then if you do have any further questions, just find me at the booth in the corner in that direction. Got any questions? Excellent. All right, thank you very much.